Very much.
So are you okay with recording the presentation?
I'm fine with recording the presentation, yes.
Okay.
Well, thank you, Jacob, for the introduction. Also welcome from my side. Good morning and good afternoon. Yeah, so it's a pleasure to do this. Unfortunately, it's still virtual, but I hope I can give you some insights into what is happening here, or what was happening in Germany a couple of months ago and what we are still doing here. So what am I talking about? So I think we're all aware of that we had a couple of economic consequences resulting from the ongoing crisis in Ukraine, and the German government decided I think it was March 2022, to introduce two very interesting measures from the travel behavior perspective. So the first one was, in order to relieve people from the price increases, that they will reduce or introduce a €9 ticket that basically allows you to travel for €9 per month on all regional and local public transport lines in Germany. And if you consider that the average travel pass previously was about 55 euros, but had only a limited regional validity, this is a huge reduction in the cost for the people, but also gives them additional benefit, as they don't need to buy several tickets, or they can now travel across the districts of the travel agencies and also across the whole nation. And the second part of this natural experiment, was also designed to relieve people from the price increases, was a fuel tax cut, which was intended to be around 20 to 30 cents per liter of gasoline and diesel. But as we all know, there are companies involved in this fuel business, and they, in the end, ended that way, that not really the full tax cut was handed over to the residents of Germany. So the behavioral experiment that we encountered in Germany in summer 2022 was most about the €9 ticket, which gives basically people a flat fare ticket at basically zero costs, because €9 is almost nothing. If you compare that, you have to pay for a daily pass from Munich, I think €8, and in Hamburg it's also like €7. So it's really, really cheap. And I think the hypothesis that we of course have is we will see a lot of induced demand. We will see, of course, mode change from the car to public transport, and also a lot of increased travel across the borders of the travel agency districts. At TUM, we are quite lucky that we have plenty of motivated researchers, but we also have the TUM think tank, which gives us at least a little bit of monetary flexibility to rapidly set up research projects in a matter of weeks or months, in contrast to just applying for a research grant, which usually needs 6 to 12 months in order to get funding. So we were able to assemble within 4 weeks a research team and also a study design. I will talk about that later. And in the end, we decided to name the study Mobilität Leben, which combines mobility and the impact of mobility on this ticket, as well as on daily activities and daily life. So given that we were a large team, our focus was on travel behavior, so studying the impact of the €9 ticket, but also see whether people are changing their energy consumption behavior. I mean, we all know that power prices are increasing or skyrocketing, as well as the cost for the heating and so on. So we would expect that people are substituting, at least to some extent, their energy costs in other activities. And that's why we also included questions on household spending and so on. So given the full the political influence of this whole design, this whole experiment, we ended up with a very simple experimental design of our study, because we know that this €9 ticket, also the fuel tax cut, is limited from June to August. So we had the challenge of getting our study set up and running by mid-end of May 2022, so that we have at least some days, some information on the travel behavior and also expenses of people before this 3 months period starts. And in order to observe travel behavior changes and also the impacts on the other aspects I was mentioning, we first of all developed together with Motion Tag a smartphone app that was available in the app stores, I think on the 24th of May, 2022, and that is running in the background of people's smartphone and collects waypoints and sends them to a Motion Tag server and generates what they are calling storylines. So they're trying to identify start and end point, identify the mode of transport, and we get this data back and can infer travel behavior, or can then analyze and model the travel behavior. In addition to the smartphone app, we then also use a very classic panel survey design. So we have a 3-wave survey. One survey wave was started at the end of May, so to have pre or before the treatment of the non-EUR-Ticket. Then we had in the middle of the period in the end of July, we had, it should read wave 2, not wave 3. And then we have the third wave at the end of September. So giving people a couple of weeks of experience without the non-EUR-Ticket, and then asks them again about what did they change and how did they eventually alter their travel behavior, and also how they now see the policy in hindsight. So I think the challenge here was really like setting up this study within 4 to 6 weeks and getting funding, getting approval, getting the app running, getting the data security officer to the position that he is supporting us at an incredible pace. And then, of course, if we have a study like this, how do we get people actively involved in supplying us with data? And in order to do so, we had 2 approaches to get people into our study. The first one was that we decided, okay, we have limited funding, we have limited time, so let's focus on the area where we have experience, where we have a lot of good data for comparison. This is a Munich metropolitan area that you see on the right-hand side of the slide, which was a focus area where we tried to target using a media campaign in May to recruit a lot of people. And as a backup, because we really did not know at that point whether our strategy was successful and whether people are willing to continue in that study, we also approached a professional panel agency to just provide us with 1,000 respondents in order to have at least some people throughout the study in the 3 survey waves in order to give us some insights on the national scale. So the panel agency was a national scale, and the remaining 1,300, 1,400 participants that we recruited from the mostly Munich metropolitan area were from Munich and the suburbs of Munich. So in the end, the panel agency did not really, wasn't really able to convince people to use the app. So from a technical perspective and from a monetary perspective, so we decided that the panel agency only recruits people for the surveys, and our media campaign tries to recruit people for the app and for the survey. And in the end, we were able to convince more than 1,000 people to use the app, and then successfully invite them and continue the study. So in the end, at the moment, we have 2,263 participants who started the study. And of course, if you have such a panel study, you have dropouts, which I will talk on the next slide. So maybe to give you some further information on the Munich metropolitan area, I think this is very important. So we have, you see on the right-hand side, the map, where you have Munich as the center of that area, but we have a couple of also quite wealthy cities around, and also some wealthy districts around. And one could say that this area is rather car dominant, despite the availability of some public transport lines, and also within the city of Munich with a very good availability of local public transport. But the modal split, if you compare Munich to other cities in Europe of similar size, and the availability of other public transport modes, car use seems to be higher in comparison. And so our hypothesis was, if you make a deep drill into why this is the case, you have a good infrastructure and available, but you also have a very weird tariff scheme around the city. So if you take a look at the lower part of this map, there was no integration tariff-wise or from the fare-wise between the city of Munich and the commuting districts. So you would have to pay in order to travel from, for example, Miesbach or Bad Tölz, or Rosenheim more than 400 euros a month in order to have a travel pass, which is ridiculous. I mean, this is basically a no-brainer than to go for the car, especially if you have the infrastructure available. And also the local tariff scheme in Munich was inside of the city rather cheap. So there was around like 50 euros, 55 euros. But if you go further out, you had very, very high prices for that ticket. So you really had an incentive not to use public transport for monetary means, but given the availability and that you don't really pay for parking in Germany, it was basically in many cases a no-brainer. But you had the availability of public transport, which gives you the choice and the option of changing your travel behavior. So if we then take a look at the study participation in our study, we see here on the right-hand side, and the left-hand side, the completion of the 3 survey waves that we had. So as I said, we had more than 2,200 people in the study, and it was completed by almost 90% of the first wave. And this then dropped continuously throughout the third wave, where we now ended up with around, let's 65 to 70% of people. And if you compare our participants, and if you put all 3 waves together, we ended up with almost 1,500 complete responses in terms of the survey. And this is high. So we have the 1/3 of that is resulting from the panel agency. So people get rewarded a couple of euros. And the people who also completed the app, so in total, the 667 people who completed the survey and the app, they got 30 euros in the end as compensation. But we experienced that people were very, very interested in this policy, and also in our study that we've seen more study participation than expected. And this is also reflected in the dropout of the app usage, and which you see on the right-hand side. So people were really interested in using that app as a travel diary for that weird period in the summer. So people not only were interested in supporting our research, but also in terms of having their own track record in their pocket and see what they did. So there is basically a few other studies who track people for such a long time. For example, Axhauser's Mobis COVID study, who used tracking people for, I think now almost 2 years during the COVID period to see how they changed the mobility behavior. And if we compare the dropout rates of the app, we see a very similar rate also in terms of registration problems and people activating the app, but then just deinstalling the app again. So in terms of the first phase of the app, we see no real differences. Maybe further information here. So we now get funding we got funding last week in order to continue our study right into the next year, but I will talk about this at the end of our study. So in the end, we can conclude here that our study was rather successful. We recruited more people than we expected. People stayed longer on the app than expected. So in order, we collected a lot of data. And I spare you here the details on the sample composition, which I have to say, or we have to admit that it's of course skewed, because given the time frame, we were not really able to recruit an unbiased or very, very representative sample, but we were able to got all genders and all ages in the age from 18 to 75. So there we have a very good coverage of the population, but we are oversampling students to some extent because we are in university-rated environment. So many people from our teams and from our chairs and from other students in our departments participated. And we also oversampled the Munich income. Munich is a very wealthy area. So in German average, we have higher income. So we have, as we say, we oversampled the rich people and to some extent academics. And but we have from all ages, from all genders, from all areas that are of interest in terms of spatial topology. We have people in our study, which allows us then to reweigh people based on some social demographic factors in order to try to get our sample more representative than it is right now. And in the following slides, I show you the first results of the study based on weighting on the demographics of age and gender, but not yet income and education. So the first question, if you approach me, and I think the question that where you're most intrigued about is whether people change their behavior. And I start with the questionnaire part, and then I move over to the app part, where people were able to measure the impact of travel behavior. And if we ask people whether they change their behavior in between two periods, so you can read this graph like before and during means how did people change their behavior from the before period to the during period, the first bar on the second bar between the during period and the after period, and the third bar before period and after period. When we ask them whether they increase or decrease car use or public transport use, we see some change in car use in the before and during phase. But then if you compare the during after and before after period, there's no big change. So the large majority of people responded that they didn't really change car use. But the interesting part really is that we see in the during after period, before during period, we see that around 40% of our study sample responded that they use public transport more. While in the fifth bar, you see that this 40% or slightly less than 40% said that they were using public transport than less compared to the during period. So, which is, I think, intuitive, as if you make public transport cheaper, more people are using it. If you make it expensive again, people again use other transport modes. But I think what is of interest here is that we see there is a large fraction of people, around, like, say 70%, who indicate, if you compare the before and after period, the people are using more public transport than before, than in the period after the ticket compared to the before period. But this is not really reflected in a large share of people who said they are reducing car use at the same rate. So we see that people stated that they changed some mode use to some extent, but they don't really substituted a lot car use with public transport. And I think this is in line with what we experience in literature in other cities and other case studies, where there is some increase in public transport use, but not that much. But this question here is really a qualitative question. Did you use more or less? So we try to, in the questionnaire, try to narrow this down, and we ask them about the trip frequencies. And you see here the trip frequency in the before, during, and after period. So before means before, then a EUR-Ticket, during in the summer month, and then after, and at the end of the period for bicycles, cars, and public transport. And here you really see the impact of an EUR-Ticket also on the trip frequencies. So there were a lot of people activated in public transport who used it occasionally before, so the light gray area, and who were relocated into higher frequency classes, which is, I think, this is easy to see the impact here. And if you watch carefully here, you see that there is a slight increase in the trip frequency in the after period, which matches to some extent the increase in car use and public transport use reported before, in the comparison between after and before and after period. So you could think that people got reactivated to use public transport, at least to some extent, through that ticket. But of course, we are losing trip frequencies compared to the during period. I think this is intuitive. But if we compare that to public transport, to car use, we really, in terms of the order of magnitude of people, we don't really see a substantial variation between these three phases in terms of car use. If you really wish to interpret something into the data at this point here, you see that it looks a little bit that car use was, for some people, less frequent compared to in the during period compared to the before and after period. So the light blue and the green colors. And if you compare that together, so if you pair the decrease, the marginal decrease in car use together with the increase in public transport usage frequency, you end up with, in our sample, around 3% of people, 3 to 4% of people who moved one bucket up in the mode use frequency of public transport and one bucket down on the car frequency, and which you can interpret as that people more or less systematically altered the travel behavior during that period here again. And maybe one note here for the bicycle, because bicycle changes, and you see here a very also a very substantial difference, which you can attribute to the changes in the weather. And because the summer was basically ends at the end of August or in September, and we have very bad weather in September when we ask people whether they use the bicycle or not. And so you can attribute this to the weather at in the after period of the user frequency here. So, okay, let me conclude from these two graphs. So we see that people are using more public transport, but they're not really substituting on a very strong basis car use with public transport. And we asked people to state how many trips per week, if they substitute, how many trips they are substituting. And you see here that in the end, around 45% of people said in our study that they at least substituted some car trips on public transport, while then on the other hand, 55% did not substitute car trips, in particular because they did not really own the €9 ticket during the time, so they were not really interested in buying this. And you see here the share of weekly car trips substituted during the €9 ticket phase, which has a peak around 10% of trips or to 20% of trips. So they did not really substitute all of the trips, but only a few. And this is, and also matches the not really substantial difference in the car frequency that we reported earlier. We also then asked people in the third wave how many car trips, on the share of car trips per week they are still substituting the car by public transport. And we see here that there are a couple of people in our study sample that are still substituting some car trips. But again, here you see, because now public transport is more expensive, the substitution is smaller compared to the during period. So again, we see that there was a behavior change in the stated behavior. And we also have the hypothesis that there is to some extent a hysteresis effect, or the people more or less got activated by that experiment and are then using public transport more intertwined in the travel behavior. So people got more intermodal, but not really changed or substituted on the large scale the car by public transport. And this also matches other studies that we have in Germany. So where there was no big substitution between these two modes. So people still use the car. The question about the carbon emission savings is yet to be determined. We are working on that, but it's. I hope that we get an answer at the decent assessment at the beginning of next year. So this now was the revealed the stated preference, and as I said earlier, we have the app in order to understand more about the travel behavior when we measure it. And first of all, let's take a look at the daily travel distances that we recorded with our app from the beginning of June or end of May to the end of September, which is our predominantly the study period of interest. And we see here that this is only for the mobile people. This is important to mention here. So we see that people in Munich are more mobile than compared to the National Travel Survey. And they are also more mobile on the weekends than compared to the travel survey. So we see here, again, the biasness of the bias of our study sample compared to the National Household Travel Survey. But again, we try to reweigh a little bit our sample in order to get better estimates. But again, you see here also the impact of Sundays and also of the bank holidays, and to some extent also the summer period. If you take a careful look, you'll see that in June it seems we have a higher average in terms of travel distances compared to July, where there were no bank holidays. While in August, summer holidays started in Munich, and so people likely were doing more trips, so the travel distance increased a little bit again. Before then, in September, it goes down a little bit. So there's a trend which can be attributed to the existence of holidays or bank holidays. Then if we take a look at the travel distances by public transport, we decided to first of all narrow it down to local trips. So we only focus on people who use public transport for less than 300 kilometers a day, because the EUR-Ticket was not really valid on long distance services. So you see here the trip distances per day for mobile users. Again, the red line is the average public transport distance per day, and you see here a substantial decrease for all users in at the end of September, which one can attribute to the drop so that the ticket wasn't valid anymore. But then again, we had like 1 week where we were substantially lower, but then afterwards the travel distances recovered a little bit. And if you take a look at the blue line, the dash blue line here, this is a line of people who stated in the first wave that they never used public transport before. But we see here a very, this is the mean of the distribution. So we see that here, at least they are using to some extent public transport in the during phase and also then after phase. But here you see with them also the pattern of that during July, it seems that the interest was declining for them, likely because it was just a normal month in Munich. And then they also had this decline of interest in the end of September. And then the first 2 weeks of September, it was basically the lowest levels we measured. But then again, it increased again. So we still have to figure out and find more explanation why this happened. You can argue here that people got reactivated, for example, as we've seen that they said that they are still substituting some trips by car. And if you then try to pull everything together, and here I have to say that we are still in the exploration phase of the data. It's way more data than we expected that we collect, and we still have problems of getting the workload funded. So we are a little bit behind of doing all the analysis. But here in this slide, you see if we aggregate all the data that we have in terms of model split by distance, you see on the upper side, the model split from the National Household Travel Survey. And you see here the 3 periods before, during, and after. And you see here again in the model split, a substantial change from an increase in car use, in public transport use, and a decrease in car use. And if you then compare this to the after period in September, you see that it went back a little bit, but it still increased compared to the before period. And you could argue that in this case, the substitution here was more about the bicycle and public transport and less about the car compared to the during period. But given the cheap price of the ticket, and also that it was basically €0, you could say that this is most likely the maximum potential of people you can motivate by pricing means to use public transport in the Munich metropolitan area. So this is not the case, and this is, again, as I said earlier, in a similar fashion and a similar dimension, the effect size as we've seen in other cities. So you don't really solve all the congestion problems and all the issues that we have with the car-dependent development, but just pricing alone, if you want to solve the problems. So we've seen that there with the EUR-Ticket, as I said, is almost €0. So the question is, if we are looking for a successor ticket, and this was widely discussed in Germany, so how much should the successor ticket cost? And we also worked on that in the surveys, and we tried to find an answer to that. And we included some questions into the survey in order to see how many people would actually buy such a Deutschland-Abo, as we call it here, at different price levels. And we offered people different options here. On the left-hand side, you see the average choice probability for buying either the Deutschland-Abo, so the successor to the EUR-Ticket, a local travel pass for your local transit district, or no pass at all. And in our maybe still bias sample, we see that there is at €49, we already match the choice probability of the Deutschland-Abo with the no travel pass option, which can be seen or can be interpreted as a situation where this is an option that is really attractive still to many people in our society. But still, the average choice probability is still having no travel pass at all, so it's still higher. So the average person is not really interested in buying that. So, but if we then use this choice model that we estimated and see which persons actually are interested in buying that, we see on the right-hand side the share of people who would buy the Deutschland-Abo at different price levels compared to two populations. The first one is, the red one is the share of those who had the €9 ticket in summer, and we see that at around 50 euros price level, that around 60% of people would buy this as a successor ticket. And if we do this analysis on all people in our sample, we end up with around 30% of people who would be interested in buying the successor ticket, which is an increase, which if you scale it up to Germany, of around 2 to 3 million people buying a travel pass. And you would, as you would expect with increasing price levels, we see that the interest declines in the ticket, especially if you recall that the average ticket price in Germany is around 50 to 60 euros. We really see that higher price levels for the Deutschland-Abo are really like discouraging buying it. What is also of interest to us in this modeling and this choice environment is that if you ask people about their willingness to pay, we really see that low-income people are biased towards, or are maximum willing to pay €1 per day. So as in the Vienna example. So people who are earning less than 1,500 euros net per month in our case, who really are not interested in all in buying the €49 ticket, because it's still for them, for the income levels, in many cases too expensive. So we don't really see an income effect in the price range 50 to 100 euros. A slight one, yes, but it's not substantial. And this not existing income effect is also reflected in the policy support of this instrument. And we were quite surprised by that. But it's interesting to see that the wide range of the population is actually supporting this effort by the federal government of simplifying public transport. And this across the board, from people of all ages, from all income levels, while we only see a split in our sample in the range of the climate change awareness and whether people are supporting measures against climate change or not. So what's next? So you may have heard that Germany already announced, or maybe I mentioned it already, that there will be a successor ticket for the €9 ticket at 49 euros. And it should start on January 1st. And initially it's a fixed term experiment, so limited to 2 years. And then they are going to evaluate it. Let's see. We're currently working on the first paper and that we want to submit before Christmas on the study and the first results. But it's a lot of data and we still have to figure out what we actually want to do with that and what is really of interest for the research community. And we will submit more papers in 2023 about this study. But at the moment, you'll find 5 research progress reports on our homepage and on archive in case you're interested. And as I said, we will also publish this preprint for the first study paper before Christmas. And I can send it to you once we have the draft ready. Yeah. Thank you very much. I'm looking forward for the discussion.